Welcome back to Mastering Change. Today, we had the pleasure of a deep and compassionate conversation with one of the most influential figures in our field, Dr. Gabor Maté. We explored relationships across the full spectrum, from the micro level of self-relationship to the macro scale of geopolitics.
Gabor is a physician, best-selling author, and speaker whose work centers on understanding the connection between childhood experiences, trauma, and adult behavior. His approach is compassionate, insight-rich, and rooted in real-world experience.
Despite the gritty nature of the conversation, it's one full of kindness and care for each other and humanity.
Gabor's wisdom offers a gentle reminder of the importance of always questioning, the power of compassion, and understanding what is underneath our behaviours.
We hope you find this as thought-provoking as we did. Enjoy. Gabor Maté, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our podcast today. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure, thank you.
As most of our listeners will already know, we start all of our podcasts with a little card game. I've selected a number of cards from a pack, and on each of these cards is a prompt. The idea being that each prompt will lead into a little narrative, a story, a bridge to connection, basically. So I am going to pull out the first card, and it says, "A time I wish I'd dealt with conflict differently, ...
Last week.
What happened?
Well, look, I'm married 55 and a half years now, and part of marriage is learning how to renegotiate conflict, because the conflict is always going to arise. You know, I never understand these marriages where they never had any conflict. And nothing triggers you like a close personal relationship, and so that. It doesn't matter how much I understand and learn and teach, I'm going to get triggered. I'm going to get into a conflictual state, and renegotiating that conflict, I think, in a new way is the constant challenge, and it's also the best way to learn. So even last night, we're in an event, and Ray says, it was a fundraiser for Gaza, actually, and Ray says, I'm going to find us seats. And then I come upstairs to the auditorium, and she hadn't found us seats. And part of me wants to go into victim mode and the complaint mode. But then I renegotiated with myself. I said, well, which part of me wants to complain here? Which part of me wants to make somebody else wrong? Which part of me can't tolerate sitting at the back of the audience? So the renegotiation had to take place within myself. Otherwise, I would have shown up as sullen and aggressive and aggrieved, and that would have ruined the whole evening. And not that long ago, I might have given into that temptation because it's a powerful one. So that's what that card brought up for me.
Brilliant. I mean, I think it's so true. And I think when you do, like obviously yesterday, you were able to kind of almost play it forward and say, right, if I do show up in this way, then I'm going to appear in a way that's sullen and kind of not the person I want to be at this event. But sometimes we can't do that, right? Sometimes we are triggered, or we are, especially in these close personal relationships, we are unable to play that tape forward or do that kind of reflection or immediate reflection. What happens, and how do we kind of repair a conflict then in a personal relationship like that?
Yeah, well, it happens a lot, and what we have to recognize, eventually we have to recognize that at such moments we're not in the present. We're suffering under what Peter Levine. And will Peter be at the conference in Oxford this year?
No, he was there 2 years ago.
Okay, so Peter Levine calls the tyranny of the past. So we have to recognize that in such moments, we're under the tyranny of the past. And what you say is quite right. There'll be times when we're not conscious. And then what happens, there's a rupture. And Ed Tronick, who's one of the great researchers of early childhood.
He will be at the conference this year.
Okay, Ed will be there. Okay. So Ed talks about rupture and repair. In fact, can I jump up from my seat for a second?
Of course, go for it.
Right there. Ed has this book called The Power of Discord. And he talks about how even in early childhood parent relationships, there's ruptures. And that actually rupture and repair is one of the dynamics of growth and development, as long as the repair takes place. Of course, in early childhood, it's always the adult that has to take the responsibility for the repair. In adult situations, we all have to take responsibility. If there's a rupture, not a problem, as long as we're committed to repair. I don't mean that any kind of rupture is okay and acceptable, but in a natural course of life, there's going to be ruptures. My tendency is, and I think that's a tendency of the ego in general, is to make myself the victim of it. And when I'm a victim, I'm expecting the other person to do the repair. So that I can feel okay. Well, I hate to tell you people, but it doesn't work that way. So there's nothing wrong with the rupture as long as we take responsibility once we become conscious of the need to repair. And that means actually looking at ourselves, which is so difficult.
Would that be the primary mechanic of repair then? Because immediately I'm taken to, I had a conversation with somebody who is in a state of rupture in a relationship that I know they hugely value, and they were looking at things like non-violent communication, doing kind of trying to equip themselves with tools, because there's a desperate want or need to navigate those ruptures. But for whatever reason, they kind of got into this virtuous circle of continuous rupture without proper repair. And so it's just like they were trying to seek and equip themselves with these mechanics of repair.
Yeah.
Your experience, what are the best ways of facilitating that?
I think we each have our own way. I mean, I've studied nonviolent communication. My problem is that precisely when I need it, it disappears. What I've found is two things. One is to recognize my body state, because any mental state is accompanied by a body state. In fact, body states even dictate mental states. So if there's tension inside me, in my chest, in my belly, my throat, I got to recognize it. And one of the things that I do teach, as I will at this Oxford workshop, is whatever there's tension, it requires attention. So if I'm noticing the internal tension, I got to pay attention to it, because I know something's going on. That's the first thing. The second thing is, what am I believing at the moment? And generally, the belief will be some variation of, I am the victim of somebody else, which means that I am powerless, I'm small. In other words, it's a memory of childhood, early childhood. So what is my body state and what am I believing? Really, really, really being curious about those two things. Well, beyond that, of course, there's an emergency kit that you could use. Emergency kit means you start breathing more deeply and more consciously, or you go for a walk, or you look at a flower, or you listen to some music that inspires you, so just to get you out of that state. But the first thing is to recognize that you're in a state, that you're actually in a state.
Absolutely. And then when you're in that more regulated state, then you can kind of ask those questions about what is it that I'm believing. And once you understand what it is you're believing, I suppose you can view the other person with more compassion, that, you've kind of approached the situation with in a victim state, or in a state that was dysregulated in the first place.
Yes. And the real value of that question, what am I believing, is, see, I never argue with people's feelings. If you tell me if you're angry, I'm not going to tell you don't feel angry. Or if you're hungry, who am I to say you're not hungry? But beliefs can be questioned. A belief, we can say, I believe I'm such and such. Is that really true? So the beliefs can be actually engaged with. Emotions, you just accept them. But you can look at the beliefs on which those emotions are based.
We've been talking about kind of conflict when it's interpersonal and in a relationship with another, like a partner or potentially family member. But our conference in Oxford in September is about the theme is healing our relational world, and we're currently in a. It feels like we're in a world where there is so much conflict, there is so much fractured, feeling and ruptures. How do we deal with something like that, for example, like when we're talking about Palestine and Israel, or what's happening politically in America, and all of these kind of where people are on different sides?
Mental, I don't know if I have a satisfactory general answer to that. I mean, Gaza, from my perspective, and anybody who knows my history knows that I'm Jewish and I'm an infant survivor, whatever that means, but I did survive the year under Nazi occupation and near death. And to my adult consciousness, I've seen nothing worse than I see in Gaza right now. And my heart is broken every day. And I've spoken about this very publicly. But all the speaking that I've done, and all the speaking that other people have done, all the movements and all the demonstrations and all the petitions have not saved a single finger of a single child in Gaza. So we have to deal with those of us that see it that way, and I well realize that not everybody does. But those of us that see it that way, we have to put up with a lot of heartache and frustration and even sometimes despair and helplessness. And so the question becomes not just how do we change the world, but how do we even endure those states of despair and helplessness and the moral injury of watching something happen and not being able to really stop any of it. That's a really difficult question. And it does come back to both the personal and the social. In other words, nobody can do this on their own, so we need to reach out and have community around it. And we have to really look at our own internal resources as well. How to change the world? I have no idea. Well, I have idea. That's not true. I have no ideas, but my ideas are irrelevant because the world is not knocking on my door asking me to change it. And Keith Starmer never phones me. Donald Trump never calls me. Benjamin Netanyahu, Viktor Orban. None of these bozos ever call me and say, Gabor, how should we behave? If they did, I would tell them, but they don't. So it's a question of, and for anybody, and I don't care where you stand, is how you're going to relate to it. Are you going to be passive or are you going to be active? Are you going to state how it is for you, or are you going to just keep quiet? I don't care what side you're on, but are you going to engage? And are you going to make the least effort to understand what the other side might be saying? Now, by understanding, I don't mean that you have to agree, but I at least want to open your mind to consider other possibilities. These are very vague cliches that I'm mouthing, I realize, but it's the best I can do.
But I think in the rather what this is what's happening there is this kind of increased polarization. This kind of need to be at one end or the other end of the spectrum, and this kind of meeting. My background in kind of corporate, you would look at negotiation training and try and find some middle ground and look for that sweet spot where you can kind of get on the same page, have a shared agenda, and work through something. And I think that for me is what's creating such fear and anxiety and doubt, is that we just be moving further apart than closer together. And that's perpetuated by the fact that we're communicating primarily with technology. I just wonder if there is anything, if you have any thoughts or observations around how we engage with one another, making this kind of polarization somewhat easier.
I tend to be kind of an extremist, so I'll just come from that place. Polarization is not necessarily a bad thing. If somebody wants to throw somebody else into an oven, which is what nearly happened to me, I hope it's polarized. I hope there'll be a lot of people saying it's not right to throw people into ovens. And there's no meeting ground between the person that wants to throw me or anybody else into an oven, metaphorically or really. There's no meeting ground. It just has to be stopped. So that's an extreme situation. Not all situations are like that, but ending polarization assumes some common intention, some common purpose, and if there's a common purpose, like if we all agree that we will live in a peaceful world, then there's some room for coming together, because then at least we can explore, what do I believe about what is keeping peace from breaking out, and what do you believe? And we can at least talk about it, if we can at least recognize and respect the commonality of our intention. In the absence of such a commonality of intention, polarization just is a recognition of reality. So it depends in what context we're talking about polarization.
I feel when we talk about polarization, I think there's what you're talking about, people who are okay with putting someone in an oven and people who aren't, those two things, or, the leaders of Palestine and Israel, like those, the one, or maybe, when it becomes to or let's say political leaders in general, that's where the kind of extreme polarization comes in. But I think when I look at it from, I see how people are reacting in the United States around the kind of Gaza Israel situation, and I think, and as you said earlier, it's kind of breaking my heart, because I think both sides have done things they should, like abhorrent things. Both sides have one, in my mind, more than the other. But that said, what I'm seeing in the States now is like, someone sent me a reel a couple of days ago that basically had a Jewish woman had gone to a concert, and there were protesters protesting about Gaza outside her concert. Now, this Jewish woman, she was, she videoed herself kind of rolling her eyes at these protesters. So there wasn't anything aggressive, but it was just a bit of an annoying, like, this Jewish woman's rolling her eyes. These people protesting for Gaza are, in my mind, right, they're peacefully protesting. The reel was a bit annoying, nothing more than that. But then someone had created another social media post about this Jewish woman who'd gone to this concert. It was all peaceful. There was no aggression at all, really. It was just this piece of content. Then this Jewish guy, and he was Jewish, he then sort of kind of came up with this almost a tirade against the Jewish woman about how she was being anti-Semitic by not understanding that the what was happening in Gaza was, murder and genocide, which it is. But it kind of all I felt after stepping back from that piece, but watching that interaction, all I felt was this cycle of hate, for and far away from where the problem is. The problem is in Palestine, and really in Palestine and Israel. But here in America, they are creating more problems, and it's almost Jewish people hating on Jewish people. And suddenly I thought, hang on a second, my initial inclination is to side with the Jewish guy who's hating on this Jewish woman who's rolling her eyes at this concert. And I was like, I don't want to side with anyone here in this situation. I don't want to be part of this cycle of hate. And that was upsetting for me.
Well, I appreciate that, and I didn't see that segment, but I know the Jewish woman who's scoffing at the protesters is not being violent, but she's being passive aggressive, and so that she's emanating, whether she means to or not, she's emanating an aggressive energy, which, however, is not hurting anybody, and she needs to be let alone to do it. That's where she's at. that's where she's at. There's no point hating on her for it. She's come from a, you know, I've been, I'll talk about this in Oxford, but I'm struck by the, what little I understand about a yogic concept of the mind, and it's got all these divisions, but four major ones, which have to do with awareness, memory, conscious, unconscious, uh, discernment, the capacity to tell the differences, and identification, identity. And here's what I realize on this Gaza issue or in any major issue in the world, what you believe has got nothing to do with the facts necessarily. It has to do with what you identify with consciously and unconsciously. So she's identifying with a certain view of herself as belonging to a people who's always been victimized, and these protesters are victimizing her again, and she's responding with a certain degree of aggressive, passive aggressive energy. But that's where she's coming from. She can't help it. And she's not, you know, I can understand that. I can also understand the rage in that second Jewish person who's responding to her. But I would not agree with him acting on that rage.
I
He
think
can say, he might be able to say, not to hate on her, he might be able to say, this brings up a lot of anger in me, because it really hurts me that a fellow Jew would scoff at people who are protesting mass killings. But to hate on her is to actually join her in that aggressive energy, and or to bring your own aggressive fuel to a fire that's already burning. It's a very difficult one because it's such an emotional issue. It brings up a lot of emotion in me and anybody I ever talk to about it. But we're responsible for how we show up. So no, hating on her is inappropriate, and it's counterproductive, actually. What would
One of
be?
my most meaningful and memorable segments of last year at Oxford was when Satdaram presented on compassionate inquiry, and lots of things came together for me in that moment, because what we've been talking about is this idea of a collective energy that draws people down, that creates this hate, this despair, this angst and anguish that really kind of is palpable. You know, you can feel it. But there are ways of shifting that paradigm, and the way that you show up, and just the way that you've described the different approach that you could have adopted to still express
Yeah.
in your viewpoint, but in an entirely framed in an entirely different way that doesn't continue this vortex of energy that's sucking everybody down with it, and that kind of is true to your belief systems, but doesn't have the effect that Minta just described that news it had on her.
Well, yes, and whether on this issue, specific issue of Gaza, or in my personal relationship, or in any other issue, I've been on I've been on all sides. I mean, sometimes I've bought into and fed and fueled the aggressive energy, and sometimes I've been able to step back and say, well, hey, let's just understand where that side is coming from, and you know, so it's a constant negotiation of how am I going to show up in a particular situation. And as I say, sometimes I look at it and say, oh my God, that wasn't what I really wanted to do. Uh, that's where you have to do the repair again, if possible, and it's completely possible to be factually right about something and at the same time show up as a completely negative, energetic being, so that the very facts you want to establish are undermined by how you show up. So it's a delicate dance with the self that we have to engage in here, of how we show up and how balanced we are, because like in any dance, like that, I know we talked about dance earlier, and when you look at dancers, how's it that they don't fall over? You know, when they leap in the air and they bend their bodies in all these different directions. By all rights, most of us will be falling all over, but they have the balance. So they can engage in the dance and this free movement and stay balanced. Well, that's why dance is such a metaphor for life.
And I'm also constantly reminded of it's not necessarily what you say, but it's how you make people feel. And that can be like a positive or a negative. You know, we've got people who make people feel something, and the content of what's being said is just, if you actually unpicked it, is not good, or it can be, you know, so this constant sense of balancing, you know, balancing the content with the feeling, with the
Well, I will push back to some degree on that one, Emma. I am I'm responsible for how I show up, not for how I make people feel. Because if I say I mean, on some issues, I could speak with the humility of Moses, Gaza being one of them. I could speak with the humility of Moses, the wisdom, compassionate wisdom of the Buddha, and the sweet love of Jesus, and people would still hate me if I said certain things. And that's based on their identity and their identification. So I warn people against believing that they're responsible for other people feel. Unless you're a parent of a small child, then you are totally responsible. Otherwise, you're not. You're responsible for how you show up. But how people feel, that has so much to do with their history, their sense of identity, their beliefs, their emotional patterning, their past. I can't be responsible for all that.
It's really interesting you saying that, because I was thinking, as you were talking, I was thinking, oh no, but I was trying to have arguments in my head about, well, you know, you could kind of play music and then you can make people feel like this way with music, or you can kind of like, you can manipulate the way people feel by, you know, external things. But then I was thinking about, I actually went to thinking about Oxford as the city and how Oxford makes me feel. When I walk through Oxford, I feel amazed by the beautiful architecture, by the like energy of academia that just seems to seep out of every stone that as I walk down the streets. And then I spoke to some, you know, in the first year we did the conference there, I spoke to some speakers of color who said to me,
Yes.
I don't feel safe in the city. I feel really unsafe and I feel really unwelcome. And I feel like, you know, that for them, it was a completely different experience and feeling than what I was feeling. And that sort of opened my eyes to exactly what you were just saying. So I don't have an argument against.
Not only that, but I mean, just objectively speaking, Cambridge and Oxford and Eton and all these institutions of the British upper class, what did they generate? They generated a whole bunch of mass murderers and war criminals and exploiters and oppressors from the point of view of anybody outside Europe. You know, you know, in um, in 1943, there was a famine in Bengal, British-ruled Bengal. Now, most British people would never have heard of this. It just doesn't count. 3 million people died. You know what Winston Churchill said about it? The great war leader and Democrat. He said, it's filthy people with a filthy religion. No, maybe he didn't use the word filthy, but he used some word, some equivalent to that. But that's how Oxford shows up in Bengal. Is people that, you know, it's a famine that could have been prevented, and not the only one, you know. And so Oxford, with all its beauty, and I know it's got such a magic, and you just feel like you're in Harry Potter or something, and the amazing architecture, the incredible culture that has emanated from Oxford, all the brilliant minds. That's all true. But so is the other side.
If
also.
I could just use that Churchill analogy for a minute, I guess what I was thinking is Churchill had the opportunity to make people feel really safe by virtue of his gravitas, his education, his connection, and so we find ourselves in a world, but necessarily the content of what he says, I guess that was the bit I was trying to say, is that we have these kind of by virtue of how we consume mass media now, we have these kind of superhumans that have the ability to compel. Not being very articulate, but I guess the way I was thinking of it is that we're not questioning enough what's being said, because somehow there's this tribal like behavior to some of the leaders or these influencers or these, and I see that particularly in children. I mean, I've got a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, and it takes everything to keep some guardrails on, because the influence is coming at them from all angles.
Yeah. Well, you've seen the TV series Adolescence, I'm sure.
Mm. Yeah.
And it's really like those kids, these kids were totally caught up in the vortex of the culture, and which was completely separated from the adult culture. So that if you look at the TV series, wonderful British, wonderfully acted, wonderfully directed, it's just an astonishing cultural achievement. Very disturbing as well. And those kids are living in a separate world from the adults, and they disdain the teachers, and they don't trust their parents. And the parents have no idea the world that the kids are living in. And I think you're talking about safeguarding your kids or setting boundaries to protect them. But that's what parents have to do these days. So that it's almost like the parents have to be a barrier against the culture rather than the culture supporting the parents.
Yeah.
The culture actually undermines the parenting role.
I was going to say, actually, other than in the adolescence, other than the policeman's son, who was the only one, which was in surprising, actually, if you think about the kind of how it was, he was the only one who kind of was relating to his father, speaking to his father. Obviously, he didn't want to be. He was very isolated from his peers, but actually was connected to his father in a way that no one else in the show was.
And really, if I can self-advertise, one of the books I wrote is called "Hold On to Your Kids: Why Parents Need to Matter More Than Peers," and that's the work of a psychologist friend of mine. I did the writing with him because he's not a writer, but it's about how kids get caught up in the peer world to their detriment, and that's what that film Adolescence was really all about. And Gordon Neufeld, he's been watching this phenomenon for decades now, of kids increasingly caught up in the whirlwind of the peer world, and occasionally, and adults losing their influence. And that means we can't guide them, and we can't orient them, we can't protect them, which is our goal.
You speak to the need to kind of to get to policymakers and game changers, because so much of that is dictated by the kind of situation and circumstances in which we're operating in, the demise of community and community connection, the fact that we live often away from our families who can support us in child rearing, the fact that two parents go to work and children get dropped off at 7 a.m. in the morning and picked up at 6 p.m. at night. The circumstances, it's like this perfect storm of circumstance and situation that fosters the environment for this to thrive. What we saw kind of really exaggerated in the context of adolescence, but that I think every parent's wrestling with.
That's what I write about in The Myth of Normal, about the culture. It's a toxic culture. But again, I'm be going back to a certain assumption, and it's worth questioning. When you talk about policymakers, you're making an assumption about their intentions. The assumption you're making, if I may say, is that their stated intentions are their real intentions. But if you actually look at deriving or divining people's intentions, not from what they say about themselves, but from what they do, what has been the intention of the British ruling class since Thatcher days? which is to take away support from families and communities and to concentrate more and more wealth and power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And it doesn't matter which party is in power, whether it's the Tory or conservatives or whether it's so-called New Labour. And if you look at under Keith Starmer, what's the first thing he did? He cut social services. To who? To the people who most need them, who will most suffer at the deprivation, who'll be most condemned as a result to ignore their children just barely to scrape by to put food on the table. So when you talk about policymakers, what assumptions are we making about their assumptions and their intentions? So it's not a question. It's not a question of. It's not necessarily a question of they're not doing the right thing. It's a question of in the service of what values or what intentions are they doing what they're doing. And if their intention is to concentrate more wealth and power in the hands of fewer people, they're doing exactly the right thing.
Yeah, and doing a good job of it, you know.
They're doing a very good job. They're doing a very
Yeah.
As a result, old people in Britain are going to be cold in the wintertime because of lack of subsidies for heating. I mean, so
I'm not sure how conscious it is. I'm not sure how much of a collective, do you know, so it just gets me thinking, it's like, are these individuals consciously, or is it just the system that's kind of perpetuating and driving that forward? And it kind of gets me thinking, if there was, like, what's the biggest lever for change that's needed then, if we want a catalyst to a world that's better for humanity, that's more conducive to living fully and well and presently, as opposed to the striving and the difficulty that seems to be so systemic.
well, in my humble opinion, which is an oxymoron because there's nothing humble about any of my opinions, but the truth is embedded in your question because you said, is it their consciousness or is it their system? Actually, the system chooses people with that kind of consciousness. So it doesn't matter how Keith Starmer will never say, my intention is to concentrate wealth in the hands of a few people. And Boris Johnson will never have said that. Donald Trump will say it because he's one of the few honest ones in that sense. But it doesn't matter what they say or think. The people with the consciousness to do what they do are selected for the positions of power. And if you don't have that consciousness, you'll be rejected like a bad apple. And I can give you contemporary examples in Britain. And so it's just how it works. And the conscious intentions are irrelevant. It's what is the embedded ideology that governs their behavior?
It's that, and it's coming back to that kind of what's their internal beliefs. They might go into politics and policy thinking that they've got this ideology and that they're going to do something good, and then the system, as Gabor, you just said, the system chooses them only if they have this embedded innate belief that they are part of this kind of system to hold on to wealth and to grow what's essentially, the white privilege. Only then will they remain in power. And if they have any other if they hold on to their ideologies, they're gone. They won't survive.
So what's our lever for change?
Well, you know what? So here's the deal. If you actually look at where people get their information from, how many people own newspapers? How many people own media outlets? What happens even in the BBC if you try and tell the truth about certain subjects like Palestine? So there's a tremendous ideological pressure on people to buy into a certain worldview that is supportive of this system. What is astonishing in the face of all that is how many people are still questioning, how many people are still wanting to know the truth, and how many people on some level don't trust what they're being told. So when you say, what's the lever for change? There isn't, and I think this is in the context of a therapeutic conversation, and we've talked a lot about politics, but you can't really separate one aspect of reality from another. But whether it comes to individual healing or whether it comes to political change, what is astonishing and I think more than encouraging is people's commitment to truth and to freedom and to justice. That's there. That's just an innate human drive, and no system and no group of politicians and no belief, no set of beliefs will ever completely extirpate that. And when people's drive for truth comes up against what they're being told, many are capable of waking up. And that's also true in our personal lives. And the stuff that we've believed about ourselves based on our traumas and our developmental influences, at some point we start questioning it. And that's where the point of leverage comes in, is when we start questioning. And I think that's a natural human drive, actually.
Amazing, Gabor. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time today on this podcast. It's been
well, thank you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you. I look forward to seeing you guys in Oxford.
Us too. Thank you, Gabor.